Imagine the slow, grinding descent through kilometer after kilometer of frozen water, the temperature dropping, the pressure building, the last traces of sunlight vanishing above you within the first few meters, replaced by a darkness so absolute that your eyes would never adjust to it because there is nothing to adjust to. No photons, no light of any kind, just ice, pressing in from every direction, creaking and groaning as the immense tidal forces of the largest planet in the solar system flex and squeeze the frozen shell twice during every orbit, 29 kilometers. That is how thick the ice is. According to the most recent measurements, 29 kilometers of solid, frozen water between the surface and what lies beneath. To put that in perspective, the cruising altitude of a commercial airliner is about 11 kilometers. You would need to stack nearly 3 of those altitudes on top of each other to equal the thickness of Europa's ice shell. Mount Everest from base to peak is about 8.8 kilometers. You could stack more than 3 Everests and still not reach from the bottom of the ice to the top. And then, after what would be an eternity of drilling, of darkness, of the crushing weight of a frozen world pressing down on you from above, something changes. The drill encounters less resistance, the ice gives way, and you break through. Not into rock, not into more ice, into water, liquid water, an ocean dark and vast and ancient, sealed beneath the ice like a secret the solar system has been keeping for 4.5 billion years. This ocean has never seen sunlight, not once in all the time it has existed. No ray of light has ever penetrated the ice shell above it. No wind has ever stirred its surface, because it has no surface, not in any way you would recognize. There is no sky, there is no shore. There is only water, extending in every direction, potentially 100 kilometers deep, with a ceiling of ice above and a floor of rock below, and a volume of liquid water that may exceed all the oceans of Earth combined. And here is the thing that keeps planetary scientists awake at night, the thing that has driven the design of a spacecraft currently hurtling through the solar system toward this very moon at this very moment, the thing that, depending on how it turns out, could be the most important discovery in the history of science, or the most important non-discovery. Something might be alive down there, not something intelligent, not something that has built cities or written poetry or wondered about the stars, almost certainly not, but something, a microbe, a cell, a self-replicating chemical system that takes in energy and nutrients from its environment and produces copies of itself, something that by any reasonable biological definition is alive. We do not know if this is the case. We have no evidence that it is, but we have evidence growing stronger with every mission and every observation and every laboratory experiment that the conditions for life exist in Europa's ocean, that the ingredients are there, that the energy sources are plausible, that the environment, while extreme by our standards, is not outside the range of what terrestrial life has demonstrated it can tolerate. And if life arose independently on Europa, if the spark of biology ignited twice in a single solar system, then the universe is not the empty, sterile, lifeless void that our loneliness sometimes tempts us to imagine. It is teeming, it is fertile, it is alive in ways and in places we have not yet begun to discover. This is the story of Europa. A moon of ice and hidden water, of radiation and tidal forces, of ancient cracks and possible plumes, and a darkness so complete that the word darkness does not do it justice. A story that begins with Galileo Galilei pointing a crude telescope at Jupiter 4 centuries ago, and that may end within our lifetimes, with a spacecraft tasting the ocean of another world. If you find this kind of deep exploration compelling, a like or a subscribe helps the channel enormously. It is a small gesture, but it makes a real difference. Now, let us begin properly. Let us start with Jupiter, because you cannot understand Europa without understanding the giant planet that dominates its existence. Jupiter is, in almost every meaningful sense, the king of the solar system. It is the largest planet with a diameter of about 143,000 kilometers, more than 11 times the diameter of Earth. It is the most massive planet, containing about 318 times the mass of Earth, more than twice the mass of all the other planets combined. If you gathered every planet, every moon, every asteroid, every comet, every grain of dust in the solar system other than the Sun itself, and weighed them all together, Jupiter would still outweigh the total. It is composed primarily of hydrogen and helium, the same elements that make up the Sun, and if it had been about 80 times more massive during its formation, the pressure and temperature at its core would have been sufficient to ignite hydrogen fusion, and Jupiter would have become a star. Our solar system would have been a binary star system with two suns and a radically different configuration of planets, and Earth as we know it would almost certainly not exist. Jupiter's gravitational influence extends far beyond its own atmosphere. It shapes the orbits of asteroids, deflects comets, and has probably served as both a shield and a threat to the inner planets over the history of the solar system. Some astronomers believe that Jupiter's gravity has deflected many comets and asteroids that would otherwise have struck Earth, reducing the frequency of catastrophic impacts and allowing complex life more time to develop. Others point out that Jupiter's gravity can also redirect objects toward the inner solar system, increasing the impact rate in some configurations. The net effect is debated, but what is not debated is that Jupiter is the gravitational architect of the outer solar system, and everything in its neighborhood exists in relation to it. That neighborhood includes a retinue of moons that, if they orbited the Sun instead of Jupiter, would be considered planets in their own right. Jupiter has at least 95 known moons, but 4 of them are in a class by themselves. These are the Galilean moons, so named because Galileo Galilei discovered them in January 1610, when he pointed his homemade telescope at Jupiter and noticed 4 small points of light arranged in a line near the planet. Over several nights he watched them move, changing their positions relative to Jupiter and to each other, and he realized they were orbiting the planet. This was a revolutionary observation. It demonstrated that not everything in the solar system orbited Earth, contradicting the geocentric model that had dominated astronomy for over 1,000 years. If Jupiter had its own moons, its own system of orbiting bodies, then Earth was not necessarily the center of everything. The Galilean moons were a crack in the edifice of the old cosmology, and through that crack the modern understanding of the solar system would eventually emerge. The 4 Galilean moons are, in order of their distance from Jupiter, Io, Europa, Ganymede, and Callisto. Each is a world unto itself, with its own geology, its own history, its own particular strangeness, but it is the relationships between them, the gravitational interactions that bind them together in an intricate orbital dance, that make the system so remarkable and that are directly responsible for the ocean beneath Europa's ice. Io, the innermost Galilean moon, is the most volcanically active body in the solar system. Its surface is a hellscape of erupting volcanoes, lava lakes, and sulfur dioxide frost, constantly resurfaced by the outpouring of molten material from its interior. More than 400 active volcanoes have been identified on Io, some of them ejecting plumes of gas and dust hundreds of kilometers above the surface. Ganymede, the 3rd Galilean moon, is the largest moon in the solar system, bigger than the planet Mercury, and the only moon known to have its own internally generated magnetic field. It too may have a subsurface ocean, sandwiched between layers of ice under enormous pressure, but Ganymede is farther from Jupiter than Europa, and the tidal heating it experiences is weaker. Callisto, the outermost Galilean moon, is a battered world covered in ancient craters, its surface largely unchanged for billions of years. It too may have a subsurface ocean, but the evidence is less compelling than for Europa or Ganymede. Europa sits between Io and Ganymede, the 2nd Galilean moon out from Jupiter, and it occupies a sweet spot in the tidal heating spectrum. It is close enough to Jupiter to experience significant tidal forces, enough to keep water liquid beneath the ice, but not so close that those forces turn its interior into the volcanic inferno of Io. It receives enough tidal energy to maintain a liquid ocean, but not so much that the ocean boils away or the surface becomes geologically chaotic beyond interpretation. Europa is the Goldilocks of the Galilean system, and its position in that system is the key to everything that makes it scientifically fascinating. The orbital relationship between Io, Europa, and Ganymede is one of the most elegant pieces of celestial mechanics in the solar system. The three moons are locked in what is called a Laplace resonance, a gravitational configuration in which their orbital periods are in a precise 1:4 ratio. For every orbit Ganymede completes, Europa completes exactly 2 orbits and Io completes exactly 4. This is not a coincidence. It is a consequence of billions of years of gravitational interaction, during which the moons nudged each other into this precise configuration and then locked into it, maintaining the resonance indefinitely. The resonance has a critical consequence for Europa. In a perfectly circular orbit, the tidal forces from Jupiter would be constant and the tidal heating would be minimal. The moon would flex into its tidally distorted shape and stay there with no ongoing flexing and therefore no ongoing heat generation. But the Laplace resonance prevents Europa's orbit from circularizing, the regular gravitational tugs from Io and Ganymede, occurring at precise intervals dictated by the resonance, keep Europa's orbit slightly elliptical. The eccentricity is small, only about 0.009, meaning the orbit deviates from a perfect circle by less than 1%. But even this small eccentricity is enough to create significant tidal variation during each orbit. Europa's distance from Jupiter changes by a small amount, and the tidal force changes accordingly. When Europa is closer to Jupiter, the tidal force is stronger and the moon is stretched more along the Jupiter-facing axis. When it is farther away, the tidal force weakens and the moon relaxes slightly. This cyclical stretching and relaxing, occurring once every 3.55 days, generates friction in Europa's interior, and friction generates heat. The amount of heat is difficult to calculate precisely because it depends on the internal structure and composition of the moon, which are not fully known, but estimates range from about 10 to the 11th watts to 10 to the 12th watts, roughly comparable to the total geothermal heat output of Earth. And this heat, generated continuously for billions of years, is what keeps Europa's ocean liquid despite surface temperatures that would freeze any body of water on Earth in minutes. Think about this for a moment. A moon orbiting a gas giant nearly 800 million kilometers from the Sun, in a region of the solar system so cold that the Sun appears as little more than a very bright star, maintains a liquid water ocean beneath its surface. Not because of sunlight, not because of radioactive decay in its core, though that contributes a small amount, but because of the gravitational relationship between three moons and their parent planet, a relationship established billions of years ago and maintained by the elegant mathematics of orbital resonance. The ocean exists because of gravity and geometry. The universe, it seems, has found a way to create habitable environments in places where no one would think to look. Let me tell you what Europa looks like, because its appearance is one of the most distinctive and most informative of any body in the solar system. From a distance, Europa appears as a smooth, bright sphere, one of the most reflective objects in the solar system. Its surface is composed almost entirely of water ice, and that ice reflects sunlight efficiently, giving the moon an albedo of about 0.67, meaning it reflects about 67% of the sunlight that strikes it. For comparison, Earth's average albedo is about 0.30, and our moon's is about 0.12. Europa is bright, strikingly so, a pale orb hanging in the darkness near the banded face of Jupiter. As you look more closely, the first thing you notice is the lines. Europa's surface is covered in an intricate network of linear features, some of them stretching for hundreds or even thousands of kilometers across the surface. These features, called lineae, are the most prominent geological structures on Europa, and they come in several distinct types. The most common are double ridges, paired raised features running parallel to each other with a shallow trough between them, like a highway with two lanes separated by a median. These double ridges can be several hundred meters wide and up to a few hundred meters tall, and they are thought to form when the ice shell cracks open, exposing warmer material from below that wells up into the crack and freezes, creating a ridge on each side. The process may repeat over time, with the crack opening and closing cyclically as tidal forces flex the ice, building up the ridges layer by layer. Some double ridges show evidence of multiple episodes of activity, with younger ridges cutting across older ones, creating a complex crosshatch pattern that records a long history of tidal stress and geological activity. There are also broader features called bands, which are regions where the ice appears to have spread apart like tectonic plates on Earth, with new material filling in the gap from below. When researchers digitally reconstruct the surface by fitting the edges of the bands back together, like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle, they find that the pieces fit, confirming that the surface has indeed spread apart. This is analogous to seafloor spreading on Earth, where tectonic plates move apart at mid-ocean ridges and new crust is created by upwelling magma. On Europa, the spreading occurs in the ice shell rather than in rock, and the material filling the gaps is ice rather than basalt. But the fundamental process, the surface pulling apart and being renewed from below, is strikingly similar. The lines on Europa's surface are not random. They follow patterns that are consistent with the tidal stresses generated by Jupiter's gravity. As Europa orbits Jupiter, the tidal forces change in direction and magnitude, and the ice shell responds by cracking along specific orientations that depend on Europa's position in its orbit and its orientation relative to Jupiter. By mapping the orientations of the lineae and comparing them to the predicted tidal stress patterns, researchers have confirmed that tidal forces are the primary driver of Europa's surface geology. The Moon's face is a map of the gravitational forces acting on it, written in cracks and ridges across an icy canvas. The color of Europa's surface is also informative. In visible light, the ice appears mostly white or cream-colored, but the lineae and certain other features are tinted reddish-brown. This coloration is caused by non-ice materials deposited on the surface or brought up from below. The exact composition of the reddish-brown material is debated, but it is thought to include salts, particularly magnesium sulfate and sodium chloride, possibly mixed with sulfur compounds delivered by Io's volcanic eruptions. If the salts originated from the ocean below, their composition would tell us something about the ocean's chemistry, which in turn would tell us something about its habitability. Sodium chloride, common table salt, would suggest an ocean chemically similar to Earth's oceans. Magnesium sulfate, Epsom salt, would suggest a different chemistry. The identification of these salts is one of the key objectives of upcoming missions. Among the most intriguing features on Europa's surface are regions called chaos terrain. These are areas where the normal pattern of lineae breaks down and is replaced by a jumbled landscape of ice blocks, ridges, and smooth, refrozen material that looks as if someone took a section of the surface, shattered it, rearranged the pieces, and let them freeze back together in a new configuration. The individual blocks within chaos regions can be identified and fitted back together like puzzle pieces, showing that they were once part of a continuous surface that was disrupted and displaced. The leading explanation for chaos terrain is that it forms when warm material from below, possibly liquid water or warm ice, rises to the underside of the ice shell and partially melts it from below, creating a lens of liquid water or slushy ice within the shell. The surface above this lens loses its support and collapses, breaking into blocks that float and rotate on the underlying liquid before the whole mess refreezes. This model is supported by the observation that the blocks within chaos regions have often subsided relative to the surrounding terrain, consistent with floating on a denser medium, and that the matrix between the blocks is smooth and appears to have been liquid before freezing. The most famous chaos region on Europa is Connemara Chaos, a roughly 90-kilometer area in the southern hemisphere that has been imaged in high resolution by the Galileo spacecraft. The ice blocks in Connemara Chaos range in size from a few kilometers to more than 10 kilometers across, and they are tilted at various angles like a collection of ice flows after a storm. The matrix between them is smooth and relatively dark, tinted with the characteristic reddish-brown color that suggests the presence of ocean-derived salts. Connemara Chaos is widely regarded as one of the best locations to search for relatively recent ocean material on Europa's surface, material that might contain biosignatures if life exists in the ocean below. Another type of terrain that suggests communication between the surface and the ocean is the lenticular features, roughly circular or oval structures scattered across the surface in certain regions. Some of these resemble dome-shaped uplifts, as if something has pushed the ice upward from below. Others are depressions, as if the surface has sagged. Still others are hybrid features with both raised and lowered sections. These lenticulae, as they are called, are typically 5 to 20 kilometers across and may represent locations where warm ice or liquid water has risen through the shell, reaching close to the surface but not quite breaking through. They are, in a sense, frozen mid-eruption, snapshots of a process that was interrupted before it could complete. One of the most important characteristics of Europa's surface is its youth. In planetary science, the age of a surface is estimated by counting craters. Craters accumulate over time as meteorites and comets strike the surface. A heavily cratered surface is old because it has been exposed to bombardment for a long time without being resurfaced. A lightly cratered surface is young because something has erased the old craters either by geological activity like volcanism on Earth or Io, or by some other resurfacing process. Europa's surface has remarkably few craters. The largest confirmed impact crater on Europa, called Puil, is only about 26 kilometers in diameter, and the total number of craters larger than a few kilometers is surprisingly small. Based on the expected rate of impacts in the Jovian system, the average age of Europa's surface is estimated at 40 to 90 million years. This is extremely young in geological terms. The solar system is 4.6 billion years old. Europa's surface represents less than 2% of that time. Something has been continuously erasing and replacing the surface for most of the Moon's history, and that something is almost certainly the combination of tidal tectonics and cryovolcanism driven by the liquid ocean below. The youth of the surface is important for astrobiology because it means that material from the ocean may have been deposited on the surface relatively recently in geological terms. If the ocean contains biosignatures, traces of biological activity, those signatures might still be preserved in the surface ice, particularly in regions of chaos terrain or near fresh cracks, where ocean material has most recently been exposed. The radiation environment destroys organic molecules on the surface. But if the material has been deposited recently and has not been exposed to radiation for too long, some signatures might survive, particularly if they are buried a few centimeters below the surface, where the radiation does not penetrate as deeply. Now let me take you below the surface, because the ice shell is only the beginning. It is the lid on a container that holds something far more interesting. The evidence for Europa's ocean comes from multiple independent lines of observation, each one compelling on its own and overwhelming in combination. The first and most direct evidence came from the Galileo spacecraft's magnetometer, As Galileo flew past Europa repeatedly during its mission at Jupiter from 1995 to 2003, it measured the magnetic field around the Moon. What it detected was not a steady intrinsic magnetic field like Earth's, generated by a dynamo in a molten iron core. Instead, Galileo detected an induced magnetic field, a field that changed in response to the changing orientation of Jupiter's powerful magnetic field as Europa orbited through it. To understand what this means, you need to know that Jupiter has the strongest magnetic field of any planet in the solar system, about 20,000 times stronger than Earth's. This field is tilted relative to Jupiter's rotation axis. So as Jupiter rotates every 10 hours, the magnetic field at Europa's location changes direction and strength. If Europa contained a layer of electrically conductive material, the changing external magnetic field would induce electric currents in that layer, and those currents would generate their own magnetic field, the induced field detected by Galileo. The key question was what conductive material could explain the observations. Rock is not conductive enough. Ice is not conductive at all. The only material that matched the strength and pattern of the induced magnetic field was salty liquid water, a global layer of liquid water at least several kilometers deep and containing dissolved salts at a concentration comparable to or somewhat higher than Earth's oceans could produce the observed induced field. No other plausible material could do it. This was the single most important observation in the history of Europa science. It transformed the subsurface ocean from a hypothesis into a near certainty. Subsequent analysis, including more sophisticated modeling of the magnetic field data and independent support from gravity measurements, has only strengthened the conclusion. Europa has a global liquid water ocean, and it has been there for a very long time. The gravity data from Galileo provided additional information about Europa's internal structure. By tracking the slight changes in Galileo's velocity as it flew past Europa, caused by the gravitational pull of the Moon's mass, scientists could determine how mass was distributed inside the Moon. The results showed that Europa is differentiated, meaning its interior is organized into layers of different density. At the center is a metallic core, probably iron and iron sulfide with a radius of roughly 600 kilometers. Surrounding the core is a rocky mantle, silicate rock similar in composition to Earth's mantle, extending to a radius of about 1,400 kilometers, and surrounding the mantle is the water layer, the ocean and ice shell combined, roughly 80 to 170 kilometers thick. This layered structure is consistent with Europa having been warm enough in its early history for the heavier materials, metals and rock, to sink toward the center while the lighter materials, water, rose to the surface. The differentiation process itself would have released energy as gravitational potential energy was converted to heat, contributing to the early heating of the Moon. But the differentiation happened billions of years ago, and the heat from that process has long since dissipated. The heat that keeps the ocean liquid today comes from tidal forces, not from primordial heat or differentiation. The ocean itself is estimated to be roughly 60 to 150 kilometers deep, depending on the model and the assumptions used. Even the most conservative estimates give a depth far exceeding anything on Earth. The Mariana Trench, the deepest point in Earth's oceans, reaches about 11 kilometers below sea level. Europa's ocean could be 10 times deeper. The pressure at the bottom of such an ocean would be immense, roughly 100 to 250 megapascals, or about 1,000 to 2,500 times the atmospheric pressure at Earth's surface. At these pressures, water remains liquid but behaves differently than at the surface. It is denser, more viscous, and has different thermal and chemical properties. In January 2025, NASA published results from the Juno spacecraft's 2022 flyby of Europa that settled a long-running debate about the ice shell. Using its microwave radiometer an instrument designed to peer beneath the surfaces of planetary bodies by measuring microwave emissions at different frequencies. Juno measured the thermal profile of Europa's ice shell. The results indicated an average ice thickness of about 29 kilometers. This was significant because there had been two competing models for Europa's ice shell. The thin ice model proposed that the shell was only a few kilometers thick, thin enough for the ocean to melt through in places, creating open water or very thin ice that could easily be disrupted. Proponents of this model pointed to the chaos terrain and surface cracks as evidence that the ice was thin and fragile, easily broken by forces from below. The thick ice model proposed that the shell was 20 to 30 kilometers or more, with the surface features created by processes within the ice itself, such as convection in warm ice, rather than by direct contact with the liquid ocean. Juno's measurements decisively favored the thick ice model. 29 kilometers of ice is a formidable barrier, far too thick for the ocean to simply melt through under normal circumstances. This does not mean the ocean is completely isolated from the surface. The cracks, ridges, and chaos terrain demonstrate that material moves through the ice shell, at least partway, and the possible plumes suggest that in some locations material from the ocean can reach the surface. But the thick ice means that any exchange between the ocean and the surface is limited, episodic, and occurs through specific mechanisms rather than through wholesale melting. Juno also detected evidence of small cracks and pores in the upper few hundred meters of the ice, but these features did not extend to any significant depth. The bulk of the ice shell appears to be solid and continuous, without large channels or conduits connecting the surface to the ocean. This has implications for the delivery of oxidants from the surface to the ocean, a process that some researchers have proposed as a key energy source for life. Now the plumes. This is where the story becomes genuinely thrilling. In December 2012, a team led by Lorenz Roth of the Southwest Research Institute announced that the Hubble Space Telescope had detected what appeared to be plumes of water vapor erupting from Europa's south polar region. The Hubble observations were made in the ultraviolet, where water molecules absorb sunlight and produce a distinctive spectral signature. The plumes appeared to rise about 200 kilometers above the surface, an enormous height given Europa's small size and low gravity, before falling back. The detection was made on two occasions, both when Europa was near the farthest point in its orbit from Jupiter, where tidal stresses would tend to open cracks in the ice. On other occasions, the plumes were not detected, suggesting that the activity is intermittent. The announcement electrified the planetary science community. If Europa was actively venting ocean material into space, it would provide a way to sample the ocean without landing, without drilling, without even touching the surface. A spacecraft flying through a plume at the right moment could capture water molecules and other materials in its instruments, analyze them on the spot, and determine the ocean's composition, including the presence or absence of organic molecules and other biosignatures. It was, in principle, a way to taste an alien ocean, but the detection was controversial. The Hubble observations were at the very limit of the telescope's capabilities. The signal was faint, and some researchers questioned whether it was real or an artifact of the data processing. Subsequent Hubble observations sometimes showed hints of plumes and sometimes did not, making it difficult to confirm the initial detection. Then in 2018, a team led by Sionze Giaya of the University of Michigan went back and reanalyzed data from the Galileo spacecraft, data that had been collected more than 20 years earlier. They focused on a particular flyby in December 1997, designated E12, during which Galileo passed within about 206 kilometers of Europa's surface. During this flyby, the spacecraft's magnetometer had recorded an unusual signature, a sudden shift of more than 200 nanoteslas occurring over just a few minutes, and the plasma wave spectrometer had detected a sharp increase in plasma density at the same time. These anomalies had been noted at the time but not fully explained. Giaia and his colleagues modeled what would happen if Galileo had flown through a water vapor plume erupting from Europa's surface. They found that a plume of the size and density suggested by the Hubble observations would produce exactly the kind of magnetic and plasma signatures that Galileo had recorded. The match was compelling. The data were consistent with Galileo having flown directly through a plume, passing through a cloud of water molecules and ice particles ejected from Europa's interior. This was the most convincing evidence yet for the plumes. It was not a new observation. It was the recognition that evidence for the plumes had been hiding in plain sight, buried in a data set from around us, waiting for someone to ask the right question. In 2023, the James Webb Space Telescope added another piece to the puzzle. Webb observed Europa in infrared wavelengths and detected the spectral signature of carbon dioxide on the surface, concentrated in the region called Tara Regio, an area of geologically young chaos terrain in the southern hemisphere. The distribution of the carbon dioxide was consistent with it having been brought up from the interior rather than delivered from external sources, suggesting that the ocean itself contains dissolved carbon compounds. Carbon is one of the essential elements for life as we know it, and its presence in the ocean would significantly increase the plausibility of biological activity. Webb also provided additional support for the water vapor plumes, detecting signatures consistent with water vapor above Europa's surface. The combination of Hubble's ultraviolet observations, Galileo's in situ magnetic and plasma measurements, and Webb's infrared spectroscopy creates a convergent body of evidence that Europa is actively venting material from its interior into space. The plumes may not be continuous. They may be episodic, occurring only when tidal stresses are strong enough to open cracks in the ice and allow pressurized material from below to escape. But they appear to be real, and they offer a tantalizing opportunity for future missions. Let me talk about the radiation environment, because it is one of the most important factors governing what can and cannot survive on and near Europa. And it is one of the most significant engineering challenges for any mission that seeks to explore the Moon. Jupiter's magnetosphere is the largest coherent structure in the solar system, extending millions of kilometers from the planet in all directions and reaching Saturn's orbit on the downstream side. Within this magnetosphere, charged particles, primarily electrons and ions, are trapped and accelerated to high energies by Jupiter's rotating magnetic field. These particles form intense radiation belts, analogous to Earth's Van Allen belts but vastly more powerful. Europa orbits deep within these radiation belts, and the radiation dose at its surface is brutal. Current estimates suggest that the radiation dose at Europa's surface is roughly equivalent to about 5.4 sieverts per day. To put this in context, a dose of 1 sievert produces radiation sickness in humans, including nausea, vomiting, and a drop in white blood cell count. A dose of 5 sieverts delivered over a short period is lethal about 50% of the time. An unprotected human on Europa's surface would receive a potentially lethal dose within 24 hours. Within a few days, the dose would be certainly fatal. The radiation also has profound effects on chemistry. The energetic particles striking Europa's surface break apart water molecules, producing hydrogen, oxygen, and hydrogen peroxide. They create reactive species that can oxidize organic molecules, potentially destroying any biosignatures that might be present. In the highest radiation zones near the equator, which is closer to Jupiter's magnetic equatorial plane, you would need to dig at least 10 to 20 centimeters below the surface to find material that has not been significantly altered by radiation processing. Near the poles, the radiation is somewhat less intense and less shielding would be needed. For spacecraft, the radiation is equally dangerous. Electronic components can be damaged or destroyed by energetic particles, and solar panels degrade under irradiation. The Galileo spacecraft experienced significant radiation damage during its time at Jupiter, and its instruments gradually lost capability over the course of the mission. Any spacecraft exploring Europa must be heavily shielded, with its most sensitive components protected by thick metal vaults, and its mission profile designed to minimize the total radiation dose by limiting the time spent in the most intense radiation zones. This is one of the reasons why the upcoming Europa Clipper mission is designed as a series of flybys rather than as an orbiter. By swooping in close to Europa for its science observations and then retreating to a higher orbit where the radiation is less intense, the spacecraft can study the Moon in detail while keeping its total accumulated radiation dose within survivable limits. Each flyby exposes the spacecraft to the intense radiation environment for only a few hours, followed by weeks of recovery in the lower radiation outer Jovian system. Over the course of the mission's planned 49 flybys, the total radiation dose will be enormous by terrestrial standards, but manageable with proper shielding. The radiation environment also has important implications for astrobiology. On the one hand, the surface radiation is destructive, breaking down organic molecules and sterilizing the surface. Any life on Europa would need to be well below the surface, shielded from the radiation by the ice shell. On the other hand, the radiation produces oxidizing chemicals on the surface, including molecular oxygen and hydrogen peroxide that could potentially serve as energy sources for life if they can be transported down through the ice to the ocean. On Earth, life exploits the chemical disequilibrium between oxidized and reduced materials. Organisms at the interface between the two can extract energy by facilitating the chemical reactions between them. If Europa's radiation-processed surface materials can reach the ocean, they could create a similar disequilibrium, providing energy for organisms that might otherwise have no source. The question is whether the surface oxidants can actually reach the ocean through 29 kilometers of ice. This is one of the critical uncertainties in Europa astrobiology. The thick ice model, now confirmed by Juno, makes this transport more difficult. If the ice shell were only a few kilometers thick, cracks could easily connect the surface to the ocean, allowing oxidants to percolate down. With a 29-kilometer thick shell, the pathways are much longer and more tortuous. The surface cracks detected by Juno extend only a few hundred meters deep. For oxidants to reach the ocean, they would need to be transported by some other mechanism, perhaps by convection within the ice itself, with warm ice rising from below and cold ice sinking from the surface, carrying entrained chemicals with it, or perhaps the chaos terrain formation process, which appears to involve partial melting of the ice shell from below, creates temporary conduits through which surface material can be mixed into the ocean. The efficiency of these processes is unknown, and it is one of the questions that Europa Clipper is designed to address. Now let us talk about the possibility of life. This is where the science becomes speculative, but the speculation is grounded in solid biology and chemistry, and it is the reason Europa has captured the imagination of scientists and the public alike. Life as we know it requires three basic things: liquid water, a source of energy, and the right chemical ingredients. Let us evaluate Europa against each of these criteria. Liquid water, Europa has it, an enormous amount of it. The subsurface ocean is one of the largest bodies of liquid water in the solar system, potentially containing 2 to 3 times the volume of all Earth's oceans. The water has been liquid for billions of years, maintained by tidal heating from Jupiter. There is no doubt about the water. It is there, confirmed by multiple independent lines of evidence. Chemical ingredients. Life as we know it is built primarily from 6 elements: carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, and sulfur, sometimes abbreviated as CH. Hydrogen and oxygen are obviously present in the water. Carbon has been detected on the surface by the James Webb Space Telescope, and its distribution suggests it originated from the ocean interior. Sulfur is present on the surface, likely delivered from Io's volcanic eruptions and potentially present in the ocean as well. Nitrogen has not been directly detected in the ocean, but it is a common element in the solar system and would be expected to be present in at least trace amounts. Phosphorus is the biggest question mark. It is relatively rare in the solar system compared to the other CHNOPS elements, and its availability in Europa's ocean depends on the composition of the rocky mantle and the extent of water-rock interaction at the ocean floor. In 2022, a study published in the journal Geophysical Research Letters modeled the delivery of phosphorus to Europa's ocean and concluded that the ocean could contain phosphorus concentrations comparable to Earth's oceans, primarily through the dissolution of phosphate minerals from the rocky seafloor. If this is correct, all 6 CHNOPS elements are available in Europa's ocean, at least in principle energy. This is the most uncertain of the 3 requirements and the area where the most active research is being conducted. Life needs energy, specifically chemical energy, in the form of redox gradients, differences in oxidation state between different chemical species that organisms can exploit. On Earth, the primary energy source for most life is sunlight, captured by photosynthetic organisms and used to convert carbon dioxide and water into organic molecules and oxygen. But photosynthesis is not the only way to power life. Deep in Earth's oceans, far from any sunlight, entire ecosystems thrive on chemical energy alone. The most famous examples are the hydrothermal vent ecosystems discovered in 1977 along the Galapagos Rift in the eastern Pacific. At these vents, seawater that has percolated down through cracks in the ocean crust is heated by underlying magma to temperatures of 350 degrees Celsius or more, enriched with dissolved minerals and chemicals, and ejected back into the ocean through chimney-like structures called black smokers. The hot, mineral-rich water meets the cold, oxygen-rich deep ocean water, creating a steep chemical gradient that life has learned to exploit. The base of these ecosystems is chemosynthetic bacteria, organisms that derive energy from the oxidation of hydrogen sulfide, methane, hydrogen gas, or other reduced chemicals dissolved in the vent fluids. These bacteria are the primary producers, the equivalent of plants in a photosynthetic ecosystem, and they support a rich community of animals including giant tube worms up to 2 meters long, clams, mussels, shrimp, crabs, and fish. The tube worms have no mouth, no stomach, and no digestive system. Instead, they contain symbiotic bacteria inside their bodies that convert hydrogen sulfide into organic molecules, feeding the worm from within. The entire ecosystem operates in complete darkness, powered entirely by the chemical energy released by the interaction of hot, reduced fluids from the Earth's interior with cold, oxidized ocean water. The analogy to Europa is obvious and tantalizing. If Europa has hydrothermal activity on its ocean floor, if hot, chemically enriched water is being released into the cold ocean through vent systems similar to those on Earth, then the same type of chemical energy that powers deep-sea ecosystems on Earth could be available to power life on Europa. But does Europa have hydrothermal vents? This is where the picture becomes more complicated. Hydrothermal vents on Earth are associated with volcanic activity, with magma close enough to the ocean floor to heat the percolating seawater to extreme temperatures on Europa. The heat source is tidal dissipation, not volcanism, and the heat is generated throughout the interior rather than being concentrated in specific locations. Whether this distributed heating can drive focused hydrothermal activity on the seafloor is uncertain. In 2024, several studies examined this question using sophisticated thermal modeling of Europa's interior. The results were mixed. Some models suggested that tidal heating in Europa's rocky mantle could generate enough localized heating to drive volcanic activity on the seafloor, particularly in certain regions where tidal dissipation is concentrated. Other models found that the heating was too diffuse, spread too evenly throughout the mantle, to produce the concentrated hotspots needed for volcanic vents. The rock would be warm throughout, but perhaps not hot enough at any particular point to melt and produce the magma that drives terrestrial hydrothermal systems. If large-scale volcanic activity is absent from Europa's seafloor, a major potential energy source for life would be missing. But this does not necessarily mean there is no energy available. There is another process, less dramatic than volcanism, but potentially just as important for sustaining life, that can generate chemical energy at much lower temperatures. Serpentinization is a chemical reaction that occurs when water reacts with certain iron and magnesium-rich minerals, particularly olivine, that are common in the mantles of rocky planets and moons. When these minerals come into contact with water, the iron in the minerals reacts with the water, oxidizing the iron and reducing the water to produce hydrogen gas. The reaction also produces heat and creates highly alkaline conditions on Earth. Serpentinization occurs wherever ultramafic rocks are exposed to water, including at certain types of hydrothermal vents called alkaline vents, at mid-ocean ridges and in other geological settings. The hydrogen gas produced by serpentinization is a potent energy source for certain types of microorganisms called methanogens, which combine hydrogen with carbon dioxide to produce methane and derive metabolic energy from the process. Methanogens are among the most ancient forms of life on Earth, and they thrive in environments that most other organisms would find inhospitable, including hot springs, deep subsurface rocks, and the digestive tracts of animals. In 2016, a NASA-funded study modeled the chemical balance of Europa's ocean and concluded that serpentinization could produce enough hydrogen to support a significant microbial ecosystem, even without large-scale volcanic activity. The study found that the chemical balance of Europa's ocean could be remarkably similar to that of Earth's oceans, with comparable concentrations of the key chemicals needed for chemosynthetic life. This finding was supported by data from the Cassini spacecraft at Saturn's moon Enceladus. Cassini flew through the water vapor plumes erupting from Enceladus's south pole and detected molecular hydrogen in the plume material. The best explanation for this hydrogen was serpentinization occurring on the floor of Enceladus's subsurface ocean. If serpentinization can operate on a tiny moon like Enceladus, which is only about 500 kilometers across, it can almost certainly operate on the much larger Europa, which has a much more massive rocky mantle and presumably more extensive water interaction. Further support came in 2024 when modeling studies showed that low-temperature hydrothermal systems on ocean moons could persist for billions of years, sustained by the slow, steady process of serpentinization, rather than by the episodic bursts of heat associated with volcanism. These slow, steady systems would not produce the dramatic black smoke events found on Earth's mid-ocean ridges, but they could produce a diffuse, continuous source of chemical energy spread across the ocean floor. This type of energy source might support a lower density ecosystem than a volcanic vent, but it could support life nonetheless, and it could do so for an enormously long time. The time scale is important. Life on Earth is estimated to have originated within the first billion years of the planet's history, possibly within the first few 100 million years. Europa's ocean has existed for approximately 4 billion years, give or take. That is more than enough time for life to have arisen if the conditions are right. In fact, if the conditions on early Europa were at all similar to the conditions on early Earth, the non-emergence of life would be the more surprising outcome. The building blocks of life, amino acids, nucleotides, lipids, are produced by chemical reactions that occur readily in the presence of liquid water, energy, and the right elements. The transition from non-living chemistry to self-replicating biology remains poorly understood, but the fact that it happened relatively quickly on Earth suggests that it is not astronomically improbable. There's another potential energy source that deserves mention, one that does not require any interaction with the seafloor at all: radiolysis. The splitting of water molecules by radiation produces hydrogen and oxidants at Europa's surface. If these products can be transported to the ocean through the ice shell, they could create a chemical disequilibrium that organisms could exploit. The oxidants would serve as electron acceptors, and the hydrogen or reduced minerals from the seafloor would serve as electron donors. Organisms at the interface, analogous to the chemolithoautotrophs found in Earth's deep biosphere, could extract energy from the reaction. The total energy available from radiolytic oxidant delivery depends on the rate at which oxidants can be transported through the 29-kilometer thick ice shell, which, as discussed earlier, is highly uncertain. Estimates range from negligible to significant depending on the assumptions about ice convection, crack transport, and chaos terrain formation. If the transport is efficient, radiolysis could be a substantial energy source, potentially comparable to or exceeding the energy available from serpentinization. If the transport is inefficient, the ocean would be isolated from this energy source and life would need to rely on seafloor chemistry alone. The combination of multiple potential energy sources, serpentinization, possible hydrothermal activity, and radiolytic oxidant delivery creates a plausible energy budget for life on Europa. No single source may be overwhelmingly productive, but together they may provide enough energy to sustain a microbial ecosystem. The energy flux would almost certainly be much lower than what supports Earth's biosphere, which is powered primarily by the enormous energy input of sunlight. Europa's biosphere, if it exists, would be a lean, sparse, slow metabolizing affair, microbes eking out a living on thin chemical gradients in the dark. But life on Earth has demonstrated that it can survive on astonishingly small amounts of energy. Microorganisms have been found in deep subsurface rocks with metabolic rates so low that they divide only once every 1,000 years or more. They are barely alive by any kinetic measure, yet they are alive and they persist, and they have been persisting for millions of years. If life exists on Europa, what might it look like? This is pure speculation, but it is speculation constrained by what we know about biology and chemistry. The most likely scenario is that Europa's biosphere, if it exists, consists of single-celled microorganisms, chemosynthetic bacteria or archaea, analogous to the organisms found in Earth's deep biosphere and around hydrothermal vents. These organisms would derive energy from chemical reactions, probably the oxidation of hydrogen produced by serpentinization, using dissolved carbon dioxide as a carbon source and producing methane or other simple organic molecules as waste products. The organisms might live on the seafloor in or around the rocks where serpentinization is occurring, exploiting the hydrogen-rich fluids that seep from the rock. Or they might live within the rocks themselves, in tiny pore spaces and fractures, as many terrestrial microorganisms do. They might live in the water column, suspended in the ocean, metabolizing whatever dissolved chemicals are available. If the ice-ocean interface is a site of chemical exchange, organisms might colonize the underside of the ice, feeding on chemicals that diffuse down from the radiation-processed surface. It is almost certainly too much to hope for complex multicellular life. Complex life on Earth, animals and plants, requires relatively high energy fluxes to sustain the complex metabolic processes that power large active bodies. Europa's energy budget is probably too low for this. The deep-sea vent ecosystems on Earth, the closest terrestrial analogue to a hypothetical Europan biosphere, do include complex animals like tube worms and shrimp, but these ecosystems are powered by volcanic activity that produces concentrated, high-energy chemical gradients. If Europa's energy sources are more diffuse, the biosphere would correspondingly be simpler, but even single-celled life on Europa would be an epoch-making discovery. It would tell us that the origin of life is not a unique once-in-the-universe event, but a natural process that occurs wherever conditions are suitable. It would transform our estimate of the prevalence of life in the universe from a single data point, Earth, to two data points, Earth and Europa, in a single solar system. The implications would be staggering. If life arose independently twice in one planetary system, the number of living worlds in the galaxy and in the universe must be enormous. There is a further tantalizing possibility. If life on Europa is biochemically similar to life on Earth, using the same amino acids, the same nucleic acids, the same basic metabolic pathways, it could mean that life was transferred between the two worlds by meteorites, a process called panspermia. Impacts on one world can eject rocks into space, and some of those rocks can eventually reach the other world, carrying viable microorganisms inside them, protected from radiation and vacuum by the surrounding rock. Mars-Earth exchange is well established. We have Martian meteorites on Earth, and simulations show that microorganisms could survive the journey. Earth-Europa exchange is more difficult because of the greater distance and the need to escape Jupiter's gravity, but it is not impossible if, on the other hand, life on Europa is biochemically different from life on Earth, using different amino acids, different genetic molecules, different metabolic strategies. It would prove that life originated independently through a different path from different starting materials. This would be an even more profound discovery, demonstrating that the universe can produce life through multiple chemical routes, not just the one that happened on Earth. It would imply that life is not a chemical accident, but a chemical inevitability, something that matter and energy naturally produce under the right conditions. Either outcome, shared biochemistry or different biochemistry, would transform our understanding of life and our place in the universe. And the only way to determine which is the case is to go to Europa, sample its ocean, and look. Which brings us to Europa Clipper. On October 14, 2024, a SpaceX Falcon Heavy rocket lifted off from Launch Complex 39A at Kennedy Space Center, carrying the largest planetary spacecraft NASA has ever built. Europa Clipper is massive, about the size of a basketball court when its solar arrays are deployed, with a total mass of over 6,000 kilograms. Its size reflects the challenges of operating in the Jovian system. The spacecraft needs enormous solar panels to generate enough power from the distant, faint sunlight at Jupiter's distance. It needs thick radiation shielding, a vault of aluminum and tantalum surrounding its most sensitive electronics to survive the intense radiation within Jupiter's magnetosphere. And it needs a comprehensive instrument suite. 9 scientific instruments in all to address the many questions about Europa's ocean, ice shell composition and geology. The spacecraft will not arrive at Jupiter until April 2030, following a long trajectory that includes gravity-assist flybys of Mars and Earth to gain the speed needed to reach the outer solar system. Once at Jupiter, it will enter orbit around the giant planet and begin a series of close flybys of Europa, eventually performing 49 passes at altitudes ranging from 2,700 kilometers down to just 25 kilometers above the surface. Each flyby is a carefully choreographed event. The spacecraft approaches Europa from a high orbit, gaining speed as it falls toward the Moon. It passes close to the surface at high velocity, with its instruments pointed at the Moon, collecting as much data as possible during the brief close approach. Then it swings away, retreating to a higher orbit where the radiation is less intense, and spends weeks transmitting its data back to Earth and preparing for the next flyby. The total radiation dose accumulated over all 49 flybys is expected to be enormous but survivable. thanks to the shielding and the flyby architecture that minimizes time in the worst radiation zones. The instrument suite is designed to answer the fundamental questions about Europa's habitability. The radar sounder called Reason will send radio waves through the ice shell and measure the echoes from internal layers and from the ice-ocean boundary. It should be able to determine the thickness and structure of the ice in detail, identify any pockets of liquid water within the ice, and potentially detect the ocean surface directly. The ice-penetrating radar is one of the most anticipated instruments on the mission because it will provide the first direct look at the internal structure of the ice shell. The mass spectrometers, MASSPEX and SUDA, will analyze any material encountered during the flybys, including gas molecules and dust particles. If Europa's plumes are active during any of the flybys, these instruments could capture and analyze plume material, determining its chemical composition with extraordinary precision. MASSPEX can detect organic molecules at parts per billion concentrations, sensitive enough to identify amino acids and other potential biosignatures if they are present. SUDA, the surface dust analyzer, can determine the composition of individual dust grains ejected from the surface, potentially revealing the chemistry of the ocean material deposited in chaos terrain and along cracks. The thermal emission imaging system ETHAMUS will map the surface temperature of Europa at high resolution, identifying locations where heat is escaping from the interior. Warm spots could indicate thin ice, recent geological activity, or the locations of plumes. The magnetometer will measure the induced magnetic field with far greater precision than Galileo, refining our estimates of the ocean's depth, salinity, and conductivity. The cameras and spectrometers will map the surface in visible and infrared light, identifying mineral deposits, mapping the distribution of salts and organic materials, and characterizing the geology of the ice shell in unprecedented detail. The mission is designed to last about 4 years in the Jovian system, ending in 2034, though the spacecraft may operate longer if it survives the radiation environment. The data it returns will keep scientists busy for decades and will almost certainly transform our understanding of Europa and its ocean. But Europa Clipper is not designed to answer the life question directly. It does not carry instruments specifically designed to detect living organisms. It can detect organic molecules, which would be suggestive but not conclusive. It can characterize the habitability of the ocean, determining whether the conditions for life are met. But a definitive detection of life, if life exists, will probably require a follow-on mission, something more ambitious, more focused, and more technologically challenging. Several concepts for such missions have been proposed. A lander that would touch down on Europa's surface, drill through the radiation-processed layer, and analyze the pristine ice beneath for biosignatures. A probe that would melt through the ice shell, descend through 29 kilometers of solid ice, and emerge into the ocean below, carrying cameras and chemical sensors. A cryobot, a heated probe that would use nuclear power to melt its way down through the ice, trailing a communications cable behind it. These concepts are technologically immense. Melting through 29 kilometers of ice would require years of continuous operation, an enormous amount of energy, and solutions to engineering problems that have never been attempted. The communications cable would need to be at least 29 kilometers long and strong enough to maintain a connection through a dynamically flexing ice shell. The probe would need to be completely sterilized to prevent contaminating the ocean with terrestrial microorganisms, a requirement that adds complexity and cost to every aspect of the design. These missions are decades away at best, but the technology development is underway. Prototypes of ice-melting probes are being tested in terrestrial ice sheets. Communication systems for sub-ice exploration are being developed. The engineering challenges are enormous but not insurmountable. The first generation of scientists who will design and build these missions are in graduate school right now, studying the data from Europa Clipper and dreaming about what lies beneath the ice. Let me tell you about Enceladus, because the story of Europa cannot be told in isolation. There is another ocean moon in the solar system, one that is in some ways even more tantalizing than Europa, and the comparison between the two illuminates what we know and what we still need to learn. Enceladus is a moon of Saturn, much smaller than Europa, only about 500 kilometers in diameter, roughly the size of the British Isles. Before the Cassini mission arrived at Saturn in 2004, Enceladus was considered a relatively uninteresting object, a small icy moon with a battered surface, not high on anyone's list of priorities for exploration. That changed dramatically when Cassini observed something astonishing. Enormous plumes of water vapor and ice particles were erupting from fractures near Enceladus's south pole, shooting hundreds of kilometers into space. The plumes were spectacular, visible against the darkness of space, and they were continuous, not episodic. Enceladus was actively venting material from its interior into the vacuum of space, and it was doing it all the time. Cassini was not designed to study Enceladus's plumes because no one knew the plumes existed when the mission was planned. But the spacecraft was adaptable, and over the course of its 13-year mission at Saturn, it made multiple close flybys of Enceladus, flying directly through the plumes and analyzing their composition with its mass spectrometers and other instruments. The results were remarkable. The plumes contained water, salt, silica nanoparticles, and molecular hydrogen. The salt indicated that the water had been in contact with rock, dissolving minerals from the seafloor. The silica nanoparticles were consistent with hydrothermal activity at temperatures above 90 degrees Celsius, suggesting that hot water was interacting with rock on the ocean floor. And the molecular hydrogen was the signature of serpentinization, the water-rock reaction that produces chemical energy. The hydrogen detection was particularly significant on Earth. Molecular hydrogen produced by serpentinization is a key energy source for methanogenic microorganisms. The presence of hydrogen in Enceladus's plumes meant that the ocean contained a chemical energy source that terrestrial organisms could, in principle, use the ingredients for life. Liquid water, chemical energy, and the right elements appeared to be present. Enceladus and Europa are in many ways complementary targets for astrobiology. Europa is larger with a much bigger ocean and presumably more extensive water-rock interaction. Its ocean has been maintained by tidal heating for billions of years, providing a long window for life to potentially arise and evolve. But Europa's thick ice shell makes its ocean difficult to access, and the intense Jovian radiation environment makes surface exploration challenging. Enceladus is smaller, with a smaller ocean and less total energy, but its plumes make the ocean directly accessible. A spacecraft can fly through the plumes and sample the ocean without ever touching the surface or drilling through the ice. The Saturn system is much less irradiated than the Jupiter system, making spacecraft operations less challenging, and the detection of hydrogen and silica in the plumes provides direct evidence for the hydrothermal activity and chemical energy that remain uncertain on Europa. The comparison between the two moons highlights a general principle. The solar system contains multiple potentially habitable environments beyond Earth, and they are not limited to the traditional habitable zone, the narrow band around a star where temperatures allow liquid water on a planet's surface. The habitable zone concept, which has dominated the search for life for decades, is a surface-centric idea. It applies to worlds where liquid water exists on the surface, maintained by the warmth of the parent star. But Europa and Enceladus show that liquid water can exist far beyond the habitable zone, maintained not by starlight but by tidal heating, a gravitational energy source that has nothing to do with stellar radiation. This greatly expands the potential geography of life in the universe. Every gas giant planet likely has moons, and many of those moons may be subjected to tidal heating that could maintain subsurface oceans. In our own solar system, Europa, Enceladus, Ganymede, Callisto, and possibly Titan all have evidence for subsurface liquid water. Other moons may as well. If subsurface oceans are common around gas giants, and if gas giants are common around other stars, which we know they are from exoplanet surveys, then the number of potential habitats for life in the galaxy is far larger than the number of planets in the traditional habitable zone. This is not just speculation. The Kepler and TESS exoplanet missions have detected thousands of planets orbiting other stars, and a substantial fraction of them are gas giants. Each gas giant could have a retinue of moons, some of them potentially heated by tidal forces, some of them potentially harboring subsurface oceans. We cannot yet detect these moons with current technology, but their existence is predicted by our understanding of planet formation, and they could number in the billions across the galaxy. The search for life in the universe is no longer limited to finding Earth-like planets in Earth-like orbits around Sun-like stars. It now includes the possibility of life in subsurface oceans on icy moons, powered by tidal energy, independent of sunlight, thriving in darkness. If life can arise in such environments, the universe is far more alive than we have dared to imagine. Let me talk about what we do not know, because the gaps in our understanding are as important as the knowledge we have gained. We do not know the composition of Europa's ocean in any detail. We know it contains dissolved salts, because the induced magnetic field requires electrical conductivity. We know it probably contains carbon compounds, because carbon dioxide has been detected on the surface and appears to originate from the interior, but we do not know the pH of the ocean, its temperature profile, its dissolved gas content, its salinity, or the concentrations of the key elements needed for life. These are not small unknowns. They are fundamental parameters that determine whether the ocean is hospitable or hostile to life as we know it. We do not know the nature of the water-rock interaction on Europa's seafloor. We suspect that serpentinization occurs, but we have no direct evidence. We do not know whether the seafloor has hydrothermal activity, alkaline vents, volcanic features, or any of the specific geological structures that provide concentrated energy sources on Earth. The seafloor of Europa is as unknown to us as the surface of Mars was before Mariner 4. We are operating on inference, analogy, and modeling, not on observation. We do not know whether the plumes are real. The evidence is strong but not conclusive. The Hubble detections are at the limit of the telescope's capability. The Galileo magnetometer data is consistent with a plume but does not prove one. The Webb observations are supportive but not definitive. Europa Clipper will address this question directly, and if the plumes are confirmed, and if the spacecraft flies through one, the science return would be extraordinary. But it is also possible that the plumes are infrequent, occurring only during specific orbital configurations, and that Clipper might not encounter one during its 49 flybys. We do not know whether life can originate in the conditions that exist in Europa's ocean. We know that life arose on Earth, but we do not know how, and we cannot say with confidence whether the same process would occur on Europa. The origin of life is one of the deepest unsolved problems in all of science. We have hypotheses, some well supported and some speculative, but we have no theory that allows us to predict where and when life will arise given a set of initial conditions. Until we understand the origin of life well enough to make such predictions, we cannot say whether Europa's ocean is alive, dead, or somewhere in between. We do not know whether life, if it exists, would be detectable by the instruments we are sending. If Europa's biosphere is sparse, with low biomass and low metabolic activity, the biosignatures it produces might be too faint to detect with current technology. Amino acids might be present, but at concentrations below the detection limits of mass spectrometers. Metabolic waste products might be diluted in the vast ocean to undetectable levels. The absence of a detection would not prove the absence of life. It would only prove that we could not find it with the tools we use. This is a fundamental limitation of all negative results in astrobiology, and it means that the search for life on Europa will likely continue for decades, with each generation of instruments being more sensitive than the last. There is one more thing I want to talk about, and it is something that is rarely discussed in the scientific literature, but that looms large over the entire enterprise of searching for life on Europa. It is the question of what the answer means, not scientifically, but philosophically and existentially. If we go to Europa and find that the ocean is sterile, that despite having liquid water for 4.5 billion years and a plausible energy source and the right chemical ingredients, life never arose, what does that tell us? It tells us that the origin of life is harder than we thought, that the transition from complex chemistry to simple biology, from reactions that merely occur to reactions that reproduce and evolve, is not an inevitable consequence of the right conditions, but a rare, improbable event that requires something more than we currently understand. It tells us that Earth might be unusual, that the spark of life might be a fluke, a one-time event in a universe that is mostly chemistry. It tells us, in a word, that we might be alone, certainly not provably, but more likely than we thought. The absence of life on Europa would not prove that Earth is the only living world, but it would shift the odds in a sobering direction. If we go to Europa and find life, the implications are equally profound, but in the opposite direction. It would mean that life is not a fluke, that wherever conditions are suitable, life arises, that the universe is full of living worlds, most of them hidden beneath ice, orbiting gas giants powered by tides, thriving in darkness. It would mean that the question is not whether there is other life in the universe, but how much of it there is and how strange it is. The discovery of life on Europa would be the most important scientific discovery in history, not one of the most important, the most important, because it would change our understanding not just of Europa or of biology, but of everything, of what it means to be alive, of how common consciousness and complexity might be, of our place in a universe that is not empty and sterile, but teeming and fertile and creative beyond our wildest imaginings. Either answer is staggering, either answer remakes our understanding of the universe and our place in it. And that is why Europa matters, not because it is a beautiful moon, though it is, not because it has an interesting geology, though it does, not because it presents fascinating engineering challenges, though it presents the most fascinating engineering challenges in the history of exploration. Europa matters because it might answer the question that has haunted humanity since the first person looked up at the stars and wondered, are we alone? The spacecraft is on its way. Europa Clipper is hurtling through the solar system right now, picking up speed from gravity assists, arcing outward toward the giant planet and its frozen moon. It will arrive in April 2030 and begin its systematic survey of Europa's surface, ice shell and ocean. Over the course of 4 years and 49 flybys, it will gather more data about Europa than all previous missions combined. It will map the surface in stunning detail. It will sound the ice with radar. It will sniff the tenuous atmosphere and any plumes with its mass spectrometers. It will measure the magnetic field with a precision that will tell us the depth and salinity of the ocean. And when the data comes back, when the scientists begin their analysis, when the papers are written and the conferences are held and the results are discussed and debated, we will know more about Europa than we have ever known. But we may not know the one thing we most want to know. Because the life question, if it can be answered at all with a flyby mission, will probably not yield a simple yes or no. It will yield hints, suggestions, ambiguities, tantalizing possibilities that demand follow-up. The detection of organic molecules in the plumes would be exciting but not conclusive. The absence of organic molecules would be disappointing but not definitive. The true answer, if it comes, may require the kind of mission that is still decades away: a lander, a drill, a probe that descends through 29 kilometers of ice and emerges into the dark ocean below, carrying instruments designed not just to detect the chemistry of water, but to detect the chemistry of life. That mission has not been built. It has not been funded. It exists only in concept studies and engineering papers and the imaginations of scientists who dream about what waits beneath the ice. But it will be built someday. The same curiosity that drove Galileo to point his telescope at Jupiter, the same determination that built the Voyagers and the Galileo and the Cassini and now the Clipper, the same stubborn, restless need to know that defines our species at its best, will drive us to build a probe that can reach Europa's ocean. It may take 20 years, it may take 50, but it will happen. And when it does, when a probe the size of a torpedo melts its way through 29 kilometers of ancient ice and emerges into the largest body of liquid water in the solar system, an ocean that has never been touched by light or wind or any form of observation, an ocean that has been churning in the dark since before the first cell divided on Earth, we will finally have the answer. We will know whether we are alone, or we will know that we never were. Europa does not care about our timeline. It does not know that a spacecraft is coming. It does not know that it is the subject of papers and conferences and grant proposals and dreams. It just orbits, as it has for 4.5 billion years, locked in its resonance with Io and Ganymede, flexed and heated by Jupiter's gravity, its ocean stirring in the dark, its ice cracking and healing and cracking again in patterns that map the tidal forces acting on it, its surface slowly renewed by processes we are only beginning to understand. Whatever is down there, if anything is down there, it has been patient. It has been waiting. If waiting is even the right word for something that may not possess consciousness or awareness or any sense of time passing for longer than complex life has existed on Earth, when the first animals appeared in our oceans, Europa's ocean was already old. When the dinosaurs ruled our planet, Europa's ocean was already ancient. When our ancestors descended from the trees and began to walk upright and look up at the sky and wonder about the points of light, Europa's ocean was already beyond ancient, a body of water so old that the word old fails to capture its duration. And now, for the first time in all of that immense history, something from outside is coming to look, something built by beings on a small, warm planet orbiting a different star than the gas giant around which Europa orbits. Something carrying instruments designed to answer questions that those beings have been asking in various forms for as long as they have been capable of asking questions at all. The spacecraft is on its way, the ice is waiting, the ocean is dark, and whatever is or is not swimming in that darkness, whatever is or is not clinging to rocks on the seafloor, whatever is or is not metabolizing hydrogen in the warm crevices where water meets stone, the answer is there. It has been there all along. We just have to go and find it. The light of the sun, so far from Jupiter that it arrives as a feeble glow barely brighter than a full moon on Earth, falls on Europa's ice and is reflected back into space, carrying no information about what lies beneath. The ice keeps its secrets, the ocean keeps its silence. The darkness is complete and has been complete since the beginning, but a spacecraft is coming and it carries instruments that can see what eyes cannot. It carries mass spectrometers that can taste molecules one at a time. It carries radar that can peer through ice like an X-ray through flesh. It carries magnetometers that can feel the shape of an ocean through the distortions it creates in a magnetic field. The spacecraft is coming and the ice is waiting and the ocean is dark, and somewhere in that darkness, in the space between the questions we have asked and the answers we have not yet received, lies the possibility that we are not alone. That life, in its simplest and most tenacious form, has found a way to exist in a place where no one expected it. That the universe, which seemed so empty and so cold and so hostile to the fragile chemistry of biology, is in fact a place where life takes root wherever it can, in whatever form it can, using whatever energy is available, enduring whatever conditions it must, persisting through darkness and pressure and cold and time, waiting as it always waits, for nothing at all. Because waiting implies expectation, and life at its most fundamental level does not expect. It simply is. Europa is out there right now, orbiting Jupiter, flexing, cracking, healing, hiding its ocean beneath a shell of ice, 29 kilometers thick, doing what it has been doing since long before there was anyone to notice, and we have noticed, and we are coming. The rest is silence for now.